Greetings all, Ferrariman601 here. A couple of weeks ago, Kunos and Assetto Corsa gave us Bonus Pack 3 for the sim, closing out 2017 in quite some style. Bonus Pack 3 certainly does feature some really cool road and race cars for our driving pleasure. However, the centerpiece of that pack, undoubtedly, indisputably, has to be this, the Alfa Romeo 33 Stradale. The name, 33 Stradale, this is already quite evocative. Yes, it's an Italian car with an Italian name. You get to sound all smart when you say Stradale. However, what are we really talking about here? The Alfa 33. First of all, it was a sports prototype car in the mid-60s, and its career went all the way up into the mid-1970s as well. Had a very long career in its own right, not that uncommon for racing cars of the era. However, in 1967, Alfa Romeo decided that they wanted to make a road version of that 3.3 prototype racing car, hence the designation Stradale. It's an Italian word that directly translates as streeting. Now, that really doesn't make any sense in English, but the idea is you take a race car, if you produce it in a Stradale trim, it is now meant for use on the road, meaning it's 100% street legal. There you go. The 3.3 is a radical departure of what Alfa Romeo was making at the time. The Alfa Romeo company has a long and storied and rather glorious history all of its own. It's really the first Italian automaker to emerge in that stereotypical now Italian sense of flair and passion and pizzazz, but somewhat questionable reliability at times. But Alfa Romeo, it started life as Darracq. Really, you had the Frenchman Darracq, who was making cars in France at the turn of the 20th century. He then decided he wanted to go to Italy and build French cars in Italy, and that really didn't work out so well. And then in the early 19-teens, right before the start of World War I, some guy from Naples comes in named Romeo, and he saves that Alfa group that was originally created at the hands of Darracq up in Milan. And the rest, as they say, is history. World War I was interesting for Alfa Romeo at that time because they started to produce gear for the Italian military. They had a whole bunch of car parts on standby in warehouses that they just couldn't produce because demand was suddenly gone because, well, all of Europe was at war. But Mr. Romeo decided, hey, let's build stuff for the military, let's salvage the company. That's what they did. World War I is over, and then some of those car parts in the warehouses, Mr. Romeo says, hey, let's make some cars out of what we've got here, and then we'll work on building new stuff later. So that's what they do, and he saves the company on a couple of occasions from bankruptcy. So Alfa Romeo very nearly died in obscurity back in the 1920s in Italy. However, with the entrepreneurial genius of Mr. Romeo, the company did survive. World War II comes along. The Italian government, headed up by one Benito Mussolini, says, hey, we need stuff for the military again. We'll kind of make you our government poster child a little bit for what the Italians can do in terms of engineering, and we're going to go out and win the war. That didn't happen. But the connections with the Italian government did not cease with Mussolini. Thankfully, however, Mussolini did cease quite famously. However, through the 1950s and 60s, Alfa Romeo, with some government backing, does continue to expand. They do shore up their production, and then the Fiat takeover happens at the end of the 80s or the beginning of the 90s. Not quite remembering, but the rest is history. Alfa Romeo today, once again, re-entering the marketplace as a premier automaker, and of course, one only needs to look at cars like the 8C and the 4C to ascertain that. But we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. This is Alfa Romeo in 1967, and this is what they're producing. As I mentioned, it's based on the 3.3 prototype race car, but this is the 3.3 Stradale, the street version. Let's go into the specifications on this thing a little bit. Obviously, it's produced by Alfa Romeo between 1967 and 1969. The assembly happened in Milan, and the designer of this wonderful car, as we'll take a look at in more detail shortly, was Franco Scaglione. The body and chassis on this thing, of course, it is a two-door sports car. You could call it a coupe. It does not have a removable top. It's a coupe. The powertrain layout, it is rear-engined and rear-wheel drive. You could call it a rear mid-engine, but the concept, at least in road cars in the mid-60s, was not quite mature yet. So some people call it a rear engine, some people call it rear mid-engine. I'd have to see the thing with no body on it to really tell you definitively, but that's where we're at there. two-door sports coupe, as we mentioned. The engine in the middle/rear/rear middle of this car is a 2-liter V8. Now this is where things start to get interesting. The mid-1960s were famous in European circuit racing for having big engines with low displacement. Big engine in terms of cylinder count, but small engine in terms of displacement. This is no different. 2-liter V8. I'm not sure on the numbers here, but this is certainly among some of the smallest production V8 engines ever produced. It may be, in fact, the smallest production V8 ever produced. Now, of course, we all know what was happening in Formula One and in some degree to sports car racing as well, with Ferrari making 1.5-liter V12s and things like that, but 2-liter V8 in a road car. This is very interesting indeed. The gearbox, it is a 6-speed manual by Colotti. This is also interesting for the era. Remember, this is 1967. Most road cars in this era had 3- and 4-speed gearboxes. Of course, you get Jaguar up in the UK making 4- and 5-speed gearboxes, but this is a 6-speed gearbox in 1967. Exceptionally rare for the time. And of course, where I come from in the United States, 3- and 4-speeds were king basically all the way up into the 1980s, and there are still some cars today that you can get with a 3-speed gearbox because, well, we're kind of behind the curve on everything in perpetuity. The final bits of specs on this Alfa 3.3, the wheelbase is 2,350 millimeters or 92.5 inches. The length overall is 3,970 millimeters or 156.3 inches. The width is 1,710 millimeters or 67.3 inches. The height is 991 millimeters or 39 inches exactly. And the curb weight, this is the most important figure of all, 700 kilograms or 1,543 pounds. So that now starts to produce a very intriguing package for us. We've got a 2-liter V8, a 6-speed gearbox, and the whole car weighs 700 kilograms. So this is not far off of what a modern Formula One car weighs here. Now, of course, we're not talking about Formula One power. We're not talking about Formula One grip by any means. But for its era, this, despite having such a small engine, really was a quick car. And of course, when we drive it, you're certainly going to get a sense of that. But, of course, in showroom view, we have to take a closer look at this thing. As we are accustomed to seeing, Kunos have done an absolutely immaculate job modeling this car, exteriorly and interiorly. I always love having a look at the grille detail here in showroom view. Yes, this is mid-60s. We're not talking about extreme aerodynamics or extreme cooling or things like that, but you can just get a little bit of a look at the modeling care that Kunos have put into this. You see the grille there, the meshwork, the Alfa badge there. Very, very nice. Alfa Romeo, Milano. Very, very cool. And you can even see some of the finer detail on the emblem itself. You can see that flag, which I believe was a standard of Milan back in the Middle Ages. You can see the serpent, and just barely, you can see the Saracen in the mouth of the serpent. Yes, there are many, many biblical allusions going on in this logo. There are many, many crusade allusions going on in this logo. We'll stay away from them because I don't really want to bring politics into this. But yeah, lots of history just in that emblem. Moving across the front end of the car, we can see the headlights, big headlights, of course, on this car in this era. They are functional, as you might expect. But just as we see on other cars here from Kunos and also from modding teams, you can definitely see the detail. First of all, you've got the outer fairings there that allows the light to shine through. And then inside, you can see the individual bulb elements. And on the uppermost bulb, you can even see the fasteners on that outer bezel holding everything in place. Very, very nicely done indeed. Looking down the side of the car, you can see this wonderful curvaceous bodywork going every which way across all of these sensationally crafted body panels. And then, of course, you can see the wheel and tire detail. The tires and the wheels and themselves are pretty much par for the course for mid-60s. They don't look particularly intriguing in terms of a modern sense, but it was what you got in the era. Big tires here, big sidewalls, and of course you can see that very, very 1960s tread pattern. Kunos doing a good job for what there is to detail on the wheels. You can see the vent holes in there, the wheel nuts. You can see the valve stem and valve stem cap casting its own shadow over the surface of the rim. Very nicely put together, I must say. Moving across to the side of the car, there is another little historical Easter egg that we must talk about. This, the four-leaf clover. Now, in my more recent review of the Quadrifoglio, we talked about the name Quadrifoglio, meaning four leaves. Well, this is the real story of the Quadrifoglio. It goes back to Alfa's early days, right after World War I, when Grand Prix racing and racing in general is starting to happen once again in Europe after the outbreak of war. Believe it or not, there was Grand Prix racing going on right at the turn of the 20th century, and then, well, Austria, Russia, Prussia, France, and England happened. Anyway, this four-leaf clover, or Quadrifoglio, literally four-leaf, has very much historical significance for Alfa Romeo. It has a very similar origin story to the Ferrari prancing horse, as a matter of fact, and believe it or not, Enzo Ferrari is connected to this four-leaf clover. Basically, it comes down to it's a good luck charm, as you might expect, but yes, that is its purpose on the car. It is a good luck charm, and the story goes back to the Targa Florio in 1919. A driver named Ugo Sivocci was driving for Alfa Romeo in the Targa Florio, and he really wasn't having so much luck. He was down in the dumps in terms of his racing results at the time. However, somebody began to suggest to him, maybe we could put a four-leaf clover on the car. It can be good luck and all of that stuff. So he has the four-leaf clover, the Quadrifoglio, painted on his car, and he wins the Targa Florio, and it stuck. This four-leaf clover is on all of the high trim level Alfa Romeos to this day. This one, of course, notwithstanding. Very, very cool story. And really, if you know your history of Ferrari, very similar story with Francesco Baracca and the prancing horse. Yep, that's how Enzo Ferrari got his logo, and that is how Alfa Romeo got their Quadrifoglio. Very cool. Looking down the side of the car, you can see these wonderful intake grills here heading back into the engine. Very, very nice. You can see very simple doors here. As far as I can tell, there are no actual door handles anywhere on the bodywork, so as not to spoil the lines, but you do have the door lock there. Looks like the only little door handle is just this little bump just a rears of the door lock where you could just slot your hand in there and open the door. You might be wondering why that door handle, that little detent, is where it is. Well, the doors on this are very, very cool. Let's have a look at how they open. Yeah, look at that. These are these dihedral butterfly doors in 1967. Now, there is a whole litany of cars that uses these kinds of doors nowadays. McLaren F1, Ferrari Enzo, you can look at Koenigsegg, and they're using a similar sort of idea, but they're dihedral yet again. The Koenigsegg is a little bit of a different design, but the overall effect is the same. It looks really, really dramatic, and this is Alfa Romeo doing this in 1967. Just think about that for a moment. You have this butterfly effect. It's not a true gull wing. It's not a true butterfly Lamborghini sense. It's this dihedral thing, and again, we see it on the McLaren F1, we see it on the Ferrari Enzo, the most famous examples I can think of off the top of my head anyway, but here it is 50 years ago. Very, very cool indeed. Looking around the rear section of the car, there are the rear tires, and you can see this wonderful grille work going on the rear three-quarter panel just before we get into the rear valance. And then, of course, quad exhaust coming out of that 2-liter V8 engine. Very, very nice. A little bit of an oil cooler, I would think, for the gearbox here at the extreme rear. And believe it or not, this little flywheel, which looks like it has as at least some of its function as a fan to pull some air through that little ancillary radiator, that actually does spin when the car is fired up. So we'll have a look at that once we drive the car. But very nice detail here on the rear. You can see the hanger brackets for the exhausts. Very, very nice. Looking across the top, we can see some louvers here. Another wonderful Alfa Romeo emblem and badging there. And then across the top through this wonderful rear glass, you can see the intake trumpets for that V8 engine beneath some meshwork. Very, very, very cool. Across the shadowed side of the car, very deep reflections in the paint. We'll close the doors. You can see the body lines uninterrupted. Very, very cool. Over here on the right-hand side of the car, we can see this little cutout area, which is not present on the left-hand side of the car. You'll notice the bodywork there is flush, and then here we have this little hatch. I'm led to believe this is the fuel filler nozzle, but don't quote me on that. I don't know for sure. Anyway, looking into the interior, you can see Kunos have done a very good job modeling that. Let's go inside this car. Let's go in the driver's side first and have a little bit of a closer look. Into the cockpit now. We'll shut the doors, get a better sense of the sight lines. And now we can see what's going on. Very sparse. Very sparse. But not in a bad way. In a rather revolutionary way, I must say. Remember, this is 1967. We're used to having cars with lots of gauges because there were a lot of things that could go wrong in a car in the mid-60s. You had to know about your temperatures, your pressures, obviously fuel level and things like that. But notice the only thing in front of the driver is a tachometer. That's it. Everything else is just off to the side in the center of the dashboard, not quite in your line of sight while you're really concentrating on driving the car. Alfa certainly were forward thinking with this. They put the tachometer right in front of the driver. There's not even a speedometer anywhere that I can see. So, hey, drive the car and drive the car fast and don't really think twice about it. Awesome stuff. Looking around the rest of the interior, you can see that we really don't have too many bells and whistles, as it were. Yes, I do know that this car is 50 years old, but at the same time, cars had radios and things in this era. Not seeing a radio here. I am seeing, though, a rather plush interior. I'm seeing leather, I'm seeing carpets, I'm seeing padded door panels and things like that. Very, very nice. Well appointed, I must say, even though it is stripped out for its era. Another thing that I'm not seeing in here, seat belts. I do not see any seat belts in this car. Of course, seat belts really did not become very common in road cars until the mid-70s, but perhaps I spoke too soon. There looks to be a seat belt there, or perhaps that's a strap for luggage on this very minuscule rear shelf. I'm not entirely sure, but it could be a seat belt. It could not be a seat belt. I don't know, but it looks like it's a seatbelt to me. Anyway, rear window here, and you can start to see the headliner detail. Very, very cool. Liking this. Another thing that you'll notice, if you look at the top of the car, you can see that it's open. No, this is not a sunroof or a moonroof or whatever you want to call it these days. What this is the top of the doors. You'll notice if you look all the way down to the side of the door, I don't believe it's actually one piece, but it has the look of being one piece. You can see that the glass is continuous all the way up from the door sill to the center line of the roof. Very dramatic. Very, very dramatic for its era. We'll open up the doors again, and you can see how the doors swing up and outward as they open. Really cool. Also, think about race cars of this era. Think about the Ford GT40, about how the doors opened in a conventional manner, but they did include a very large portion of the roof area in that opening panel to move with the door. So definitely a nod to the design trends. Very nice indeed. We talked about the instrumentation. We'll be able to see it a little bit better once we get out on track, but just basically a tachometer. That's the only thing that we're really going to be addressing while we drive this car. And notice, it has no red line on it. Instead, it's got a little white line on it, and it's sitting there at just about 8,500 RPM. Yes, this is a 2-liter engine in 1967 that will rev past 8,000 RPM. In fact, it'll rev past 9,000 RPM. It'll get you damn near 10,000 RPM in 1967. I know it's low displacement, and I know it's a high cylinder count, so low displacement, high cylinder count engines tend to be high revving, but still, Formula One engines of this time were just barely reaching 10,000 RPM. So this is a road car doing it. And of course, they're doing it with all mechanical stuff. They're not using pneumatic valves. They're not using any of these exotic materials. It's just pure mechanical wonderment. Really, really fantastic. Leaving the cockpit now, we'll take a look around the passenger side and just show you what we can see. And if you were a passenger here in the 3.3, this would be your view. Really nothing for you to play with, save for maybe a couple of those switches, one of which I assume controls the fuel pump, so don't hit that. But basically, it's somewhat plush. and you're just going to hang on tight for the ride of your life. Notice these big grab bars here. Yes, they're to help you open the doors, but I also imagine they might give you a little bit of a false sense of security if you're whipping this thing around a few corners. Really, really nicely done, Kunos, inside and out. Really, really loving what you've done with this car. Leaving the interior for one final time. And just taking a look here at the Alfa 3.3 Stradale. Really, it is an exceptionally beautiful car. I don't think there's any person on earth, whether you're a car guy or not, who could look at this car and just have no reaction whatsoever. I look at this thing and I think, yes, that's a car. That's what a car should look like, and I think many of you probably are having that reaction as well. However, more reactions are to come because we're going to go and we're going to drive this thing next. Welcome to Monza. Before we get out on track, of course, we're going to have a look through the setup screen and show you what's what here on the 3.3 Stradale. It is a road car, so we have fixed gearing here. First through sixth gear, you can see, in theory, sixth gear maxes out at 298 kilometers an hour, about 183, 184 miles per hour. But remember, we're not talking about a whole lot of horsepower here, and we're talking about 1960s aerodynamics in big air quotes, so we're not hitting that, not even on the longest road in the world. But there's your gearbox. Tires, you have a single compound to choose from. It's the vintage compound. Default pressures are at 30 psi, which is about where you'd want to run. You can go all the way down to 9 if you so desire, and all the way up to 45. We're going to stick to the default setup in its entirety. Fuel, we have got it zeroed out to keep the engine quiet, but maximum fuel capacity is 94 liters. It defaults to 30 liters there on default setup. Alignment, camber, and toe on all four corners. You can adjust this if you'd like. Generic, this is the rev limiter. Defaults to 100, goes all the way up here to 109. That's where we're going to be running. We're going to be pushing 10,000 RPM out of this 2-liter V8 engine. Brake power down there at the bottom there. That's it on the setup screen for this Alfa. It's really simple, but it's not supposed to be a technical car to drive. It's supposed to be a fun car to drive, and that's what we're going to do right about now. I mentioned in showroom view that flywheel at the back. Let's take a look at it now, shall we? You can see there the engine ticking over. That flywheel is spinning away quite merrily. And you can hear that wonderful V8 engine. Listen to it again. Yeah, it's a little engine, but it's got some big sound behind it, I must say. Here in the cockpit, everything is now well and truly alive. Doesn't look all that much different because we don't really have too many lights and things, and certainly no LCDs to distract us from anything. It's just a real pure car. Let's go and see how it runs. We'll bring up our information for you as always. We'll bring up the pedals, and because we're talking about a manual gearbox, we'll bring up the gear display. Otherwise, you'll have no clue what gear I am in. So that's in the lower left for you, as always. Now, let's go drive this thing. First gear is punched up. Bring the revs in. It's a road clutch, so we don't have to be so harsh with it. There we are. You can hear those driveline elasticity effects. The car kind of bogs down and surges forward again. You get that even on many manual road cars to this day when the revs are kind of low when you're pulling away. Very nice touch. 5,000 revs, 6,000 revs, short shifting by a lot here, just getting my bearings in this car. You can see the tattletale line though, right at 8,500 RPM, this engine will rev. Just now passing through 110 miles an hour or so. Now full revs, 9,000 RPM in a 50-year-old engine. That's something. getting hard on the power here. You can see most of the engine's power is way up high, so you can get on the throttle mid-corner at lower revs and not worry about it. Of course, no driver aids to speak of in cars of this vintage. (9,300 RPM is when the engine starts to complain a little bit. And coming on to start finish to complete our first lap. Now that I've got my bearings in the car, let's start talking about how it drives. Well, the first thing that strikes you is, well, it is a 1960s car, and it's a 1960s road car at that. So if you're looking for a razor-sharp, fully connected driving experience, well, it's not it. However, for the era, it most certainly would have been. You have to remember what most cars were in the 1960s. With the exception of your Jaguar XK120s and things like that, most road cars of this era were kind of boring. Even your Ferraris of the era were getting a little bit of a reputation for being more plush than they were sporty. I mean, of course, we can talk about the 365 Daytona until we're blue in the face, but that's one of the few exceptions. This, coming out when it did, certainly would have caused a stir. The steering is quite direct, given its age. I won't exactly call it sharp, but there is not much delay between you putting the steering lock in and the car reacting. Of course, you've got to remember the technology of the era, so this would have been quite responsive in its day. And even today, it is still quite impressive, given what this car is. Engine power, it's manageable. We'll definitely use that little bit of nomenclature here. No, we're not talking about a tremendous amount of horsepower. We're talking about 200 to 220 horsepower, which for most road cars of the era, that was really enough. You got to remember your premier race cars of the era were making 400 to 450 horsepower, so this is certainly enough in that time period of the mid-1960s. The revs, though. Listening to this thing rev is where it starts to get really unique. 9,000 RPM! 9,000 RPM 50 years ago! That's so cool in a road car. Really, it is. Of course, you come off the throttle, you can hear the throttle valve slam shut, you can hear the engine pull a vacuum momentarily, and then it barks out the exhaust with that backfire on the overrun. It's really cool. That's a visceral part of this experience, and Kunos did an absolutely fantastic job modeling that. Throttle cracks open again. You can hear a little pop as everything starts to suck air in with a little bit more sense of an urgency there. Really nice. In terms of the car's overall speed, well, you can see what we're doing. 200 clicks, just accelerating gradually, consistently, but gradually. The gearbox is a peach. It's a little tricky initially, but you get the hang of it soon enough. I would imagine that the real car would have been double clutch all the way around. They probably just threw a racing gearbox into this thing, if I had to be a betting man, so probably unsynchronized all the way. Of course, that's not strictly necessary here in Assetto Corsa, but you can get the idea. Underneath the banking, 8,800 revs or so. The brakes, they definitely feel of the era.
However, the car is so light that it is quite sufficient. The braking power is quite sufficient just because the car weighs 700 kilograms. Of course, we're talking about lightweight aluminum bodywork and things like that. No real composite work in this era, particularly not on road cars, but the lightweight certainly does help the performance in all categories. A little bit of a breathe off the throttle there to counter a little bit of mid-corner understeer through parabolica. Letting the speed build. There goes 200. 215, 220, fifth gear. You'll notice we haven't gotten into sixth gear yet. There's really no need. Very long gearing in this car. If I could adjust the gearing, I would definitely want to make it a bit shorter. But for extended cruising, you would want to put it into top gear anyway and just sort of meander your way along. Just at the very peak of the rev range there, about 9,000, the engine really starts to scream. Sounds even a little reminiscent of the Cosworth DFV of the era. But at the mid-range RPM, it has a very nice throaty growl to it. I really like that. On the brakes, prop it downshift. Because the car is so light, weight transfer through corners like Ascari, as you can see. Yeah, the suspension, you get a bit of wander in it, of course. It's not the most stiffly sprung thing in the world, but the weight being low means you can throw the car around and you can get into some nice drifts if you want. Also, you could just sort of allow the car to kind of hunt its way through the corner. And this is something that maybe we talk about when we drive vintage Formula One cars, particularly the mid-60s ones, because they're so long and rather cigar-shaped, and they're very narrow as well, and the chassis flex kind of helps you across the bumps with the weight transfer. You get a similar sort of dynamic in this car. You know that it's not the most rigid thing in the world. It's certainly nowhere near as rigid as a modern road car, but it works. Everything just fundamentally works in this car, and that's quite nice. A little bit of power oversteer to the exit of De La Roggia. Very, very nice. Very nice indeed. You can pitch it in, drift it. You don't quite have the torque that you need to sustain those drifts, at least not in third gear. But the car just very gradually finds its center point again, without much help from the driver. The car is just inherently well balanced. It wants to go straight. It really does. It wants to find its happy point of neutrality and then get back on its way. Of course, given the chance to drive one of these in reality, I certainly would not be being as exuberant with it as I currently am, because as far as I know, less than 30 of these were ever produced, and, well, I don't have any numbers of what they do when they do change hands, but I would imagine the asking price for a car like this would be north of $20 million. Just a conservative estimate, just because of its provenance, just because of how rare it is, and just because of just what it is in general. this would be an extremely expensive investment. But certainly a worthy one if you were in such a position to do it. Coming down the straight here, I really like the look of the steering wheel, a 3-spoke wheel, leather wrapped, very simple, no buttons, no switches, no Bluetooth connectivity to interfere with your driving experience here. Just 3 aluminum spokes. You can see Monza is embossed in that bottom spoke there on the steering wheel. And then of course you can see the screw heads holding the wheel to the steering column, emblazoned with that Alfa Romeo emblem, constantly reminding you of what you're in. Constantly connecting you to that history, constantly reminding you of, hey, you're in an Alfa, drive it. Will it win any awards for lap time? Will it win any awards for top speed? The answer is no to both of those questions, but at the same time, it will win so many awards for style, for beauty, for grace, for just sheer appreciation value that this car has. It's enormous. It really is. As far as its subject matter as being included in Assetto Corsa, this definitely deserves to be here. This definitely belongs here. This is right up there with cars like the Lotus 49 in terms of their rarity for sure, and in terms of their significance historically speaking. This 100% deserves to be here, and it's a blast. Truly it is. Coming down the straight here, pulling 5th gear, 220 clicks, still accelerating. It's not quite leisurely, but you don't feel harried in it. You really don't. Everything happens at its own pace, and you're kind of along for the ride in a lot of respects. Yes, you're driving it. Yes, if you do want to hurry it through the corners, it will oblige, but at the same time, that to me does not really do the car justice. I mean, yeah, it is quick enough, and particularly given its age, it's 50 years old, it really is quick enough when you go back to the time period from whence it came, but I don't think the point of this car is to drive it fast. I mean, yes, it can do it, and I do agree with the notion that you should do it at every possible opportunity, but at the same time, just listening to it, just going through the gears, just getting on the power out of a corner. There's a visceral value there, an intrinsic visceral value, and I don't think it's something to be trifled with. I really don't. In a sense, driving the car quickly and going for all-out speed, you might overlook those smaller details, and I think that would diminish the overall experience of this car. Looking at the trim on the dashboard, very neatly clad in leather and suede. Looking at the gauges there, I still don't see a speedometer anywhere in this car. That's almost a little comical, but I am seeing an amp meter, oil temperature, oil pressure, fuel pressure, all things of that nature. The only instrumentation in this car is directly related to operating it and directly related to driving it. There are no distractions at all. Got a little bit over exuberant there, that's okay. Would I like to own this car in real life? Well, part of me wants to say definitely yes, but another part of me is saying definitely no, and it's not because of what the car is, it's not because of how it drives, it's certainly not because of how it sounds or how it looks, but I think that even if I were able to purchase something like this, and even if I had the ability to care for it and to look after it and store it and make sure that it was fettled in the way that a car like this should be attended to, I don't think that I would quite be the appropriate person to be the custodian of something like this, because a car like this 3.3, given how rare it is and given its provenance and given the situation that Alfa Romeo was in the mid-60s of being involved in racing but still having some teething problems, if you will, in the commercial market to some degree, the car is far more significant than any one person ever could be. It's far more significant as just an entity in and of itself that supersedes anyone who ever owns it, because there are so few of them, and anybody ultimately who ever owns a car like this is just passing through the car's life, really. These cars will remain with us long after their owners have moved on. And to be in that sort of position of being the custodian of something like this with its storied history and with its attributes as they are, I think the pressure would be a little bit too much for yours truly. Turn it around and get back toward the pit lane. See, at low speeds, it's all very well contained. It truly is. 3,000 RPM here, doing 60 miles an hour or so. Becomes civilized, it really does. I don't think there's really anything uncivilized about it. It's elegant, it's refined, yet at the same time, you do remember the exclusivity that it has. It's food for thought. This car has kind of made me a bit pensive. Wasn't expecting that, but it has. In any event, there it is, the Alfa Romeo 3.3 Stradale. It's really a very interesting car in many aspects. I mean, first of all, the obvious outer looks of it. It looks like very few other things, and like I mentioned in showroom view, it is quite reminiscent of its contemporary, the Ford GT40. Of course, the GT40 was built for a very different time and place, but you can definitely see some temporal resemblance there. This car, it's a road car through and through. It's based on a race car, but this is definitely a road car for the road that you can take on spirited drives, and certainly you could take it to the racetrack too and have some fun, although for its modern value, I'm not sure you'd want to, but at any rate, just the silhouette of that wonderful shape, those curvaceous front fenders, those curvaceous rear fenders, the roof line as it descends down the rear clamshell, it really looks so cool. From the front, it resembles some Porsches of the era. It resembles the Ford GT40 in a lot of ways. Toward the rear end, it's very evocative of the Lancia Stratos and the Ferrari Dino of similar vintage. I mean, it's all of the ingredients of an absolutely legendary car are here. And that's quite appropriate because this is an absolutely legendary car from one of the most storied marks in motoring history. Alfa Romeo 3.3 Stradale, it is in Bonus Pack 3, the free DLC from Kunos that was released right at the end of 2017. Really awesome car. I consider it to be the centerpiece of that DLC, and certainly if you somehow have not gotten the chance to drive it yet, go out and drive it, because you will not be sorry that you did. No, it is not a speed demon. No, it's not really going to be challenging for any world records, but that's not the point of a car like this. The point of a car like this is just to appreciate it, whether you're looking at it from the outside and fawning over its details, or you're driving it and you're appreciating the sounds and all of the visceral parts of the experience. That's what this car is about, and that's how this car has commanded my respect. At any rate, of course, there are hot laps to follow here at Monza with the 3-3 Stradale without commentary from both internal and external views, so do please stay tuned for those hot laps. Thank you all very, very much for watching. I know a few of you have wanted this review for quite some time, and here it is. I hope you have enjoyed it. Stay tuned for the hot laps, please. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you for watching, and we will see you soon.